It is 1929, October. You are 34 years old. You have a job at a steel mill in Pittsburgh. You have a wife, 2 kids, a rented house on Maple Street with a small backyard where your daughter grows tomatoes in the summer. You are not rich, but you are stable. And in 1929, America stable feels like everything. You have $400 in a savings account at First National Bank. You have $200 in stocks. Your brother-in-law convinced you to buy in last spring, told you everybody was making money, told you it was easy. The market had been going up for years. There was no reason to think it would stop. On October 24th, the market opens and something feels wrong immediately. Prices drop, then drop again, then drop faster. The ticker tape cannot keep up. By noon, nobody knows what anything is worth. Brokers are shouting. Men are standing on the street outside the exchange, reading the tape with expressions you have never seen on adult faces before. You find out at dinner. Your wife has the radio on. The announcer is calm, but the numbers he's reading are not. You lose your $200 in stocks in 2 days. You tell yourself it is fine. You still have the savings account. You still have the job. By 1932, you do not have the job. The steel mill cut 60% of its workforce. You were not in the first wave. You were in the second. You had 3 weeks' notice and a handshake. The savings account is still there. You have been living on it for 4 months. There is $47 left. You are one of $15 million Americans in exactly this position. Welcome to the Great Depression. My name is Sienna, and this video is not a history lesson. It is a survival guide written in the past tense, because every economic crisis America has lived through left behind the same information: who survived, who did not, and exactly what the difference was. Not in theory, in specific documented human decisions made by real people under real pressure. Today, I am going to put you inside every major American economic crisis from the 1900s to right now, not as a spectator, as the person living it, and at the end of each one, I am going to show you the exact financial behavior that separated the people who came out the other side from the people who did not. The pattern is always the same, and it is always teachable. The Panic of 1907. You are 28 years old. New York City. You work as a bank clerk at Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the most respected financial institutions in the city. October 1907. A failed attempt to corner the copper market triggers a chain reaction. Rumors start that Knickerbocker is insolvent. The rumors are not entirely accurate, but accuracy does not matter once a bank run begins. On October 22nd, you arrive at work to find a line of depositors stretching around the block. They want their money. All of it, right now. The bank does not have all of it on hand. No bank does. That is how banking works. And by afternoon, Knickerbocker has suspended payments. You watch your employer collapse in a single afternoon. The panic spreads to other banks. Credit freezes. Businesses cannot make payroll. The stock market falls 50% in 3 weeks. The crisis is stopped by one man, J.P. Morgan. Not the government, not the Federal Reserve, which does not yet exist, personally organizes a bailout of the banking system from his private library. He locks the most powerful bankers in New York in a room and does not let them leave until they agree to pool their resources and stop the collapse. The lesson from 1907 is not about stock markets or banking. It is about the speed of panic. The people who survived 1907 financially were not the people who reacted fastest. They were the people who did not react at all. Depositors who withdrew everything in the first hours, locked in real losses, and then had nowhere safe to put what they withdrew. Depositors who stayed, whose banks survived the panic, lost nothing. The psychological trap of 1907 is the same trap of every crisis since. Panic feels like action. Action feels like safety. But in financial crises, the action most people take in the first 72 hours is almost always the wrong action. What the survivors did, they stayed. They did not react to rumors. They did not move money based on what their neighbor was doing. They held and they waited. The Great Depression, 1929 to 1941. You already know this one. You were the steelworker in Pittsburgh, but here is what you did not know at the time. The people who came out of the Great Depression in better financial shape than they entered it, and some did, shared 3 specific behaviors that almost nobody talks about when they teach Depression history. First, they held assets that produced real output. Farmers did not just survive the Depression. Many of them thrived relative to everyone else because food demand did not disappear with the stock market. If you owned land that grew food in 1929, you had something everyone needed regardless of what the economy was doing. The Depression was devastating for industrial industrial workers and financial speculators. It was a rough but survivable decade for people whose assets produced physical things people could not live without. Second, they eliminated all variable and speculative debt before the crisis hit. The people who lost their homes in the Depression were almost universally people who had taken on debt during the 1920s boom. Mortgages, margin loans for stock purchases, consumer installment debt for cars and appliances. When income fell, the debt payments did not fall with it. The people who owned things outright, small paid-off homes, tools, equipment, kept them. The people who owed money on things lost them. Third, they had cash or near cash savings in solvent institutions. Not all banks failed. Roughly 9,000 out of 25,000 American banks failed between 1930 and 1933. The 16,000 that survived held deposits that remained intact. The people who had spread savings across multiple institutions, or who had kept some savings in physical form, were better positioned than people who had everything in a single institution that happened to be in the failed 36%. The Pittsburgh steelworker who lost everything lost it not because the Depression happened. He lost it because he had no assets outside the industrial economy, he had speculative stock exposure on margin, and he had no savings cushion deep enough to survive a multi-year income interruption. The farmer in rural Ohio who kept his land, his tools, and his $300 in the First Federal Savings Bank of Columbus, which did not fail, emerged from the Depression with his life largely intact. Same country, same decade. Asset selection was the entire difference. What the survivors did, they held productive assets, eliminated speculative debt, and kept savings in multiple solvent institutions. The stagflation, Sire Sets, 1973 to 92. You are 31 years old. Suburban Detroit. Your husband works at Ford. You work part-time at a school cafeteria. You have 2 kids, a mortgage, and a 1971 Ford LTD that gets 12 miles to the gallon. October 1974. Arab members of OPEC embargo oil exports to the United States in response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The price of oil quadruples in 6 months. You find us out not from a newspaper, but from a gas station. The line stretches 6 blocks. There is a sign limiting purchases to 10 gallons. You sit in line for 2 hours on a Tuesday morning and get 8 gallons. The attendant tells you to come back Thursday. The economy does something it has never done before, or at least something economists claimed was impossible. Inflation and unemployment rise simultaneously. Prices go up while jobs disappear. The textbook said this could not happen. The textbook was wrong. By 1980, inflation is running at 13.5% annually. Your mortgage payment is fixed. That is good. But everything else is not. Groceries, gasoline, utilities. The cost of feeding your family is rising faster than your husband's wages are increasing. The Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker eventually crushes the inflation by raising interest rates to 20%. The cure is brutal. The prime rate at 20% means anyone carrying variable rate debt, credit cards, adjustable mortgages, business loans, is being destroyed by their monthly payments. The families who survived stagflation intact shared one critical advantage: fixed-rate debt. The 30-year fixed-rate mortgage taken in 1965 at 5.5% became one of the best financial positions to hold during the inflation of the 1970s. You were repaying $1965 with $1978 that were worth half as much. The inflation was working for you on your fixed obligation while it was working against everyone else on their variable ones. The families who suffered most were the ones who had taken adjustable rate mortgages, who had significant credit card balances, and who had no hard assets. Their cost of living rose with inflation, and their debt payments rose with interest rates simultaneously. The lesson of stagflation is the same lesson Franz learned in Vienna. Inflation destroys paper savings. It does not destroy land. It does not destroy productive assets. It does not destroy fixed-rate debt obligations. It actually benefits the debtor on those. The people who had positioned themselves even partially outside the paper economy were protected in ways they did not fully understand until the crisis made the protection visible. What the survivors did: they held fixed-rate debt, owned real assets, and avoided variable-rate borrowing during the inflationary period. The Savesens and Launchresses, 1986 to 1995. This one is less famous than the others, but its lessons are precise. You are 44 years old. Dallas, Texas. The oil boom of the early 1980s made Texas feel invincible. Real estate was the trade. Everyone you knew was buying property, raw land, commercial developments, apartment complexes. The savings and loan institutions, the S&Ls, were lending aggressively on all of it. When oil prices collapsed in 1986, the Texas real estate market collapsed with it. The S&Ls that had lent against inflated Texas real estate values were suddenly holding loans that were worth more than the properties securing them. They started failing, then failing faster. The federal government eventually had to bail out the system at a cost of $130 billion to taxpayers, the largest financial rescue in American history up to that point. The specific trap that destroyed ordinary Texas families in this crisis was concentration. People who had put significant wealth into Texas real estate during the boom lost it when the boom ended. People who had diversified, who had some Texas real estate but also some stocks, some savings in federally insured accounts, some assets outside Texas entirely, survived. The S&L crisis is not taught in schools. It should be, because it is the clearest possible example of geographic and asset concentration risk. When your entire financial life is tied to one sector in one region, you are not investing, you are betting. And the bet is eventually called what the survivors did. They diversified across asset types and geographies. They did not put everything into the dominant local asset class regardless of how certain it felt. The dot-com crash, 2000 to 2002. You are 29 years old. San Francisco. You work at a startup that has not made $1 of profit but has a valuation of $400 million because it has a website and a vision statement. The late 1990s felt like a different physics. Companies with no revenue were worth billions. Your stock options on paper were worth $180,000. You told your parents not to worry about retirement. You were going to take care of them. March 2000. The NASDAQ peaks at 5,048, then starts falling. By October 2002, it has fallen 78%. Your options are worth zero. Your company has laid off 80% of its staff. You are in the 80%. The dot-com crash is a perfect illustration of one specific financial concept. The difference between paper wealth and real wealth. The $180,000 in options was never real until you sold it. You did not sell it. The people who did sell, who converted paper gains into real assets before the crash, kept their money. The people who held options in companies that went to zero converted nothing and kept nothing. But the dot-com crash also produced a generation of accidental survivors who did not understand why they survived. The people in San Francisco in 2000 who had boring, diversified index fund investments instead of concentrated tech stock exposure did not feel smart in 1998 when the NASDAQ was doubling. They felt left behind. They felt cautious and square and unsophisticated compared to their colleagues writing options to paper millions. In 2002, they had their money. Their colleagues had stories. The lesson of the dot-com crash is that concentration in the exciting asset of the current moment is almost always the wrong position when you examine it from the other side of the collapse. What the survivors did, they diversified, they sold paper gains and converted them to real assets, and they did not hold concentrated positions in any single sector regardless of how certain the growth felt. The 2008 financial crisis. You are 38 years old. Phoenix, Arizona. You bought your house in 2005 for $340,000 with a 5% down payment and an adjustable rate mortgage. Your payments started at $1,850 a month. The mortgage broker told you to refinance before the rate adjusted. Everyone was refinancing, he said. It was easy. Values were going up. By 2008, your house is worth $210,000. You owe $322,000 on it. You cannot refinance because you are underwater. Your adjustable rate has now reset and your payment is $2,400 a month. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers collapses. The credit markets freeze. Your husband works in construction. New builds stop completely within 30 days. He is laid off in October. You have $4,000 in savings. Your monthly expenses are $30,800. You have just over 1 month of runway. By January 2009, you were in foreclosure proceedings. The 2008 crisis is the most documented financial collapse of the modern era. The data on who survived and who did not is precise. The single most predictive variable of financial survival in 2008 was the emergency fund, not investment portfolio quality, not income level, not home equity. The emergency fund. Families with 3 to 6 months of expenses in liquid savings held through the crash. They kept their investments. They made their mortgage payments. They waited for the recovery that began in March 2009 and arrived in full by 2013. Families without emergency funds were forced to make decisions under maximum pressure, sell investments at the bottom, miss mortgage payments, access retirement accounts with penalties. Every forced decision made their position worse. Every forced decision was a direct consequence of having no cushion. The 2008 recovery was one of the most powerful in American history. The S&P 500 went from 676 in March 2009 to over 4,000 by 2021. The people who held their index fund investments through the crash captured the entire recovery. The people forced to sell at the bottom captured none of it. Same crash, same recovery, different cushion, completely different outcome. What the survivors did: they had emergency funds. They held diversified index fund investments without selling. They had fixed-rate mortgages they could afford on reduced income. They waited. The COVID crash 2020. You are 33 years old. Chicago, March 2020. The world shuts down in 2 weeks. The S&P 500 falls 34% in 33 days, the fastest crash in American history. And then something unexpected happens. The Federal Reserve floods the system with liquidity. The government sends stimulus checks. Interest rates go to zero. The market bottoms on March 23, 2020, and begins one of the fastest recoveries ever recorded. By August 2020, the S&P 500 has fully recovered. By the end of 2020, it is up 16% for the year, despite the worst pandemic in a century. The people who sold in March 2020 locked in 34% losses and missed the entire recovery. The people who held, or who bought more at the bottom, captured extraordinary returns. But the COVID crash also produced a new crisis hidden inside the recovery. The stimulus money, the zero interest rates, the supply chain disruptions. They created inflation. By 2022, inflation was running at 9.1%, the highest since 1981. The people who had learned the stagflation lesson, fixed-rate mortgages, real assets, some inflation hedge, were protected in 2022. The people who had variable rate debt, high cash savings losing value to inflation, and no hard assets felt the squeeze from a different direction. The 2020-22 period is the clearest modern demonstration that crises do not always look the same. Sometimes the threat is deflation and unemployment. Sometimes it is inflation and purchasing power erosion. Sometimes it is both. The financial positioning that survives all versions is the positioning that is not dependent on any single economic environment being stable. What the survivors did: they held through the crash without selling, they held fixed-rate debt that benefited from the subsequent inflation, and they had enough diversification to capture the recovery while hedging against the inflation that followed. Now let me give you what 120 years of American economic crises actually teach us about positioning your money in 2026. The crises look different on the surface: a bank panic, a decade-long depression, an oil embargo, a real estate collapse, a tech bubble, a mortgage crisis, a pandemic. Each one has a different trigger, a different villain, a different political context, but the financial behaviors that protected ordinary people in every single one of them are identical. Behavior 1. Hold assets that produce real output regardless of what the economy is doing. In 1907, it was farmland. In 2008, it was an index fund held through the crash. In 2022, it was real estate with a fixed mortgage. The specific form changes. The principle does not. Behavior 2. Keep fixed-rate debt and eliminate variable rate debt. In 1929, the people with no debt survived. In the 1970s, the people with fixed-rate mortgages survived and actually benefited from inflation. In 2008, the people with adjustable-rate mortgages lost their homes. In 2022, the people with fixed-rate mortgages watched their real payment burden decrease as inflation eroded the value of their fixed obligation. Behavior 3. Maintain 3 to 6 months of liquid emergency savings at all times. This one appears in every single crisis survival account, not as the most exciting strategy, as the most important one. The emergency fund is not what makes you rich. It is what keeps you from being forced to make permanent financial decisions during temporary financial crises. Behavior 4. Diversify across assets, geographies, and time horizons. The S&L survivors were not more intelligent than the people who lost everything in Texas real estate. They were more diversified. The dot-com survivors were not more intelligent than the people who lost their option fortunes. They were more diversified. Concentration feels like conviction. In a crisis, it is revealed as risk. Behavior 5. Do not react in the first 72 hours. The 1907 depositors who moved money in the first hours made the worst decisions. The 2008 investors who sold in October captured none of the 2009 recovery. The 2020 investors who sold in March missed the fastest recovery in market history. Every financial crisis produces a window of maximum fear that is also, historically, the worst possible time to make permanent changes. The discipline to not act is harder than acting. It is also more valuable. Here is what this means for you right now in 2026. The next crisis is not a question of if. It is a question of when and what form it takes. It might be inflation continuing to erode purchasing power. It might be a recession triggered by debt levels. It might be a geopolitical event nobody is currently modeling. It might be something that does not have a name yet because it has never happened before. What you control is not the crisis. What you control is your position when it arrives. If you have no emergency fund, that is your only job this week. 3 months of expenses in a high-yield savings account. Marcus, Ali, SoFi, 4 to 5% right now. Nothing else matters until that exists. If you have variable rate debt, credit cards, adjustable rate loans, anything with a floating interest rate, that is your second priority. The 1970s are the instruction manual for what variable rate debt does to ordinary families when inflation persists. You do not want to learn that lesson personally. If you have an emergency fund and no variable rate debt, open a Roth IRA at Vanguard or Fidelity this week. Total Market Index Fund. Automate it. The 2008 survivors and the 2020 survivors both held this instrument through crashes that felt unsurvivable and came out the other side. The steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1929 did everything his father told him to do with money. He was saved. He worked. He trusted the system. The system failed him. The financial behaviors that protect ordinary people are not the behaviors the system teaches. The system teaches you to save in its accounts, invest in its products, borrow at its rates, and trust its institutions. The 120-year record of American economic crises teaches something different. It teaches you to hold assets that exist outside the system's ability to fail. It teaches you to maintain a cushion thick enough to hold through crises that feel unsurvivable. It teaches you to not act when panic is loudest. And it teaches you that the gap between the people who came through each crisis and the people who did not was almost never income. It was almost always preparation. You have the record now, all 120 years of it. The next crisis will add one more data point to the pattern. Make sure you are on the right side of it. Subscribe if this channel is giving you a different way to think about your money. Share this with someone who thinks the next crisis cannot happen to them. The Pittsburgh steelworker thought that too. I am Sienna. I will see you in the next one.